afternoon, fewer than half of black people in the UK feel proud to be British. That's according to a startling new survey citing racist attitudes towards immigration. Elsewhere, 98% of those asked said they sometimes had to make compromises to fit in, including altering hairstyles or speech patterns, with the report author calling it a wake-up call for Britain. Joining me now, author, journalist and TalkTV regular Nels Abbey. Hi, Nels, good to see you. And actor and director Kelechi Okafor. So nice to have you in the studio. Thank you very much for coming in. So I have just said in that introduction, controversial survey, surprising and startling news. But just before we went on air, I asked you both, are you surprised by this? And you said not in the least, Kelechi.
Yeah, I wonder who it surprises, because within the black population or within the black community, I don't think many people would be surprised, because when we talk about what it means to be British, what does that mean when a lot of our heritage, we're looking at families who have felt the direct sort of impact and violence of what Great Britain meant in terms of imperialism. So what then are we proud of if we haven't addressed this history?
On the other hand, I think some people will think, let's just take Windrush, obviously pre the Windrush scandal, which has been heartbreaking and completely appalling and may well have made huge impacts on the way people feel. Like, absolutely take that. But the people who came here, came here feeling all kinds of affinity and respect for and affection for and highly, highly intense knowledge of the history of Great Britain, and came anticipating, didn't they, all kinds of, you might say, wonderful things.
Right. That's a fantastic PR. Because I think that if a country is able to colonise your country as a result, I guess, of the transatlantic slave trade, and say to you, the motherland needs you to come and help with the NHS and to come and help with the railways and all of these things, and you come over expecting for the streets to be paved with gold and that you'll be treated with any sort of integrity, and then you're met with not quite that, that illusion becomes scattered very, very quickly.
And so in terms of the next generation, so the people who did come and the people who, as you quite rightly say, were asked to come and were fulfilling an invitation to come and, as you say, help build the NHS and help build the roads and railways and everything else, London transport. And they came and, as you say, got a reception that was not what they had been expecting: hostility, racism, discrimination, not able to do the jobs that they were perfectly capable of doing, not able to have the housing that they could barely afford in the first place, freezing cold, it was grey, it was raining, the food didn't taste of anything. There was a hell of a lot to be disappointed. A lot. And then, of course, they settled down and in many cases gave birth to the next generation. Would they have been saying about being British to their children and then to their grandchildren?
Interestingly, I can only go off the lived experience that I have, right? Interestingly, parents would usually still speak highly of Britain. They would still say, like, my mum would say to me, oh, I know the national anthem. And I was like, you go, girl. There's still a pride there. Yet we are looking, as the children, looking at the ways that they've been treated within, the workplace, within the healthcare system, housing, all of these things. And we're looking at them thinking, but what are you proud of? Like, what have you gotten back from the, the pride and the heart that you've put into weaving the tapestry of this country?
Nels, would you say the same?
Yeah, I would, almost word for word, yeah, absolutely. What it presents, so what Kelechi eloquently pointed out there, when we think of Windrush, for example, we often don't really contextualise Windrush really properly, because the people who came on who came on the Windrush, the boat, not just the scandal itself, those are people whose lives had been defined by the economic interests of Britain for hundreds of years. And they were never, ever compensated. They were the burden bearers of Britishness, as were the Africans or so. Kelechi is Nigerian, I'm Nigerian, Kelechi is Igbo, I'm Shakiri. And it was the exact same thing. Even if you take a look at, say, Kelechi's history as an Igbo person, the Biafran War, when Britain went and created this amalgamated or put together hundreds of different ethnic groups. When one of them actually wanted to step aside and say we want to become an autonomous country, Britain armed the Nigerian state to the teeth and actually pretty much facilitated what was essentially a genocide upon 2 million people. So when you actually look at so much history that's actually happening there, the more you read a book, the more you learn, the more you listen, the more you actually see around you. You learn from what you've seen in the past, what's happened in the past, and you see what's happening around you today. The idea of being proud to be British is pretty much, it's almost like asking yourself to delude yourself. much, it's almost like asking yourself to delude your book. The more you learn, the more you listen, the more you actually see around you. You learn from what you've seen in the past, what's happened in the past, and you see what's happening around you today. The idea of being proud to be British is pretty much, it's almost like asking yourself to delude yourself.
I mean, I come, as you probably know, from a Jewish family.
Of course.
And my family, all different branches of it, you know, came to escape the Holocaust, some of them to escape the pogroms in you know, Middle Europe, because if they hadn't, they'd have had their head bashed in and they'd have been killed. And I think I was brought up to think, predominantly, aren't we lucky?
Yeah.
Aren't we lucky to be here? We're so lucky because in this country, although there is racism, although there is still anti-Semitism, although we've just done an item of it on the show about Roger Waters today, he's about to perform at the Palladium and might well have a giant inflatable pig hanging over his head as he performs with the Star of David on it and all the things he said. And that's just one individual, but of course we've just been through the whole.
Is that real?
Yeah, that's
wow.
real.
I've had
the
no
whole
idea. Okay.
the whole anti-Semitism in the Labour Party's saga, and it goes on and on and on. And yet, I think we were brought up to think, and I can't speak for every Jew in the country, of course I can't, but we were brought up to think, thank God we're here. Thank God in general no one's trying to kill us. We can sleep at night, thank goodness. There are Jewish schools if you want to send your child to a Jewish school. I mean, I know that, for example, both my uncles changed their surname. One of them's a surgeon and one of them's a lawyer, so that they could make progress in their careers, because it was felt if you had a Jewish-sounding name, a foreign name, you know, you wouldn't get on in your career. So I'm not saying that there was no anti-Semitism or racism. Of course there was, and there continues to be. But still, I think a feeling of pride in Britishness, because it was thought to be a liberal country, it was thought to be progressive, it was thought to be the home of Shakespeare and wonderful music and all kinds of things that we're proud to be part of. But as I'm sitting talking to you, I'm kind of quite confused by the whole thing. And so I suppose people might be wondering, you live here, presumably you might well go on to give birth to the next generation here and the one after. How does it feel living in a country that you're not proud to be a part of?
Do you want to go? Ladies first.
I think that's a fascinating question, because in other ways, we're asked the same question all the time. Whenever I critique Britishness or Britain, somebody inadvertently will say to me, so why don't you just leave? Because if you don't like it so much, well, why don't you just go? And again, we're not taking into consideration the economic reality of what colonialism, the transatlantic slave trade, what that has meant in terms of the infrastructure. Like when we look at Nigeria, as Nels mentioned, the amalgamation of ethnic groups forced together and not allowed to separate, yet Britain still continues to extract so much from Nigeria, yet we're told that, they're constantly getting handouts, as it were. I can't go back until the things go back. We're still having conversations with the British Museum about the Benin bronzes. There is so much economically that Britain benefits from countries that a lot of us are from. And until those countries kind of get equal parity, then how can we go back?
Do you feel the same?
Yeah, I feel that. So I'm somebody who pretty much, I live a fairly international life. I'm British, of course. I live in Britain. It's not being proud to be black, to be British per se, or not having that inherent flag-waving, rule Britannia, last night at proms type of thing inside you. So it's very different from not actually liking to live somewhere. So I actually do enjoy living in Britain. I do enjoy my life here. Don't get me wrong, I enjoy my life when I'm in Miami or Lagos or anywhere else too at the same time. But the key thing about it is that wherever I go to, the moment I open up my mouth, the moment I speak, people identify me with a particular place. And the problem with it is this, too, is that the concept of even being proud of being British is that it really works well up until Britain reminds you that you are not part of this.
Right. Have you personally felt that happening to you? Have there been occasions regularly where you are reminded in a way that sometimes is a shock to you, because you're feeling as if you're enjoying it, you're part of it, this is where you live, this is your life, you're having lunch, you're watching TV, you're laughing at the jokes, you're enjoying everything, and suddenly some horrible thing happens that makes you think, oh my God, I'm othered here?
Sometimes it's 4 words. Where are you from?
Yeah.
Right.
And then it's like, well, what do you mean? From here? Well, my case is slightly different because I was born in Nigeria, I came here when I was 5, but you wouldn't know that to hear me, to look at me, you wouldn't know that. But I'm always asked, where are you from? So in those instances, you're reminded all the time that you're not of this land.
It's because beyond just actually have something happen. So I've been in things like hard stops before. I've been stopped and searched more times than Donald Trump's been arrested.
How many times do you think you've been stopped and searched?
I could not tell you. It's been so many times.
Really?
And it's, but beyond it, I've also been in a hard stop where the police run up on you with their guns out, which is immensely scary. But even it's not just what I go through. It's what Kelechi goes through. It's what the lady remember the lady in Croydon,
yes,
who was pretty much roughed up by the police officer because of her actual bus fare or so. It's what she goes through. It's what different, because it's that concept we call empathy. So I see myself in Kelechi. I'm sure Kelechi sees herself inside me. So if I was to go and when we see something like, say, a Chris Cabba, who is our brother who was actually killed by the police. Now, whatever happened there, but we're about to go through a court case. And if we then see the whole entire police force actually throwing down their guns and say that we should be able to kill these people with impunity or so, it really makes you question that.
So now let me ask you something. Zola Braverman made that speech in Washington. The Home Secretary made a speech, and one of the things that she said was, multiculturalism is not working. The things that she said was, multiculturalism.
Be able to kill these people with impunity or so, it really makes you question that.
So now let me ask you something. Zola Braverman made that speech in Washington. The Home Secretary made a speech, and one of the things that she said was, multiculturalism is not working. When she said that, what did you think and how did you feel?
I thought that was a very interesting statement for Suella to make, because I would controversially say that Britain is not a multicultural country. It's multi-ethnic. There are many ethnicities here. But in terms of one culture, we abide by one culture, and that is the homogenous British culture. And if we don't assimilate, then there's this whole thing of, then why are you here? Get out. So multiculturalism being used in that way, almost as a threat, is exactly why we don't have multiculturalism, because it's always seen as othered, and whatever is other is dangerous. And we see it, like Nels said, with what's happened with Chris Cabba, what we see happening with people who are looking for accommodation, who are seeking asylum. So many instances where we're reminded that Britain talks about being tolerant, but what does it mean to tolerate something? You don't like that thing initially, you're tolerating it. So even our language has so much power.
But it's fascinating to hear you say that there is one prevailing culture, because as you said it, I'm struggling to think, well, what is it then? What prevailing culture? What do you mean? What kind of a culture is it that you're intimating is kind of imposed upon us, that we have to be a part of? What is it? Give me an example of
But I think that's why it's so brilliant, because it almost exists without being identified. When it comes to something like the coronation, for instance, those who said, oh, I'm not into celebrating the coronation, you almost looked at like you had three heads. What do you mean you're not celebrating the coronation? But if you were to take into account my culture, my history of not being Nigerian, you'd understand exactly why I don't want to celebrate the coronation. So it's things like that where one thing is the thing, and to not abide by it, there's a problem.
On the other hand, at the time, it was said that it was a generational thing, that young people, and you're beautifully young, were just not into it, didn't understand why it was a big deal, you know, weren't really, inspired by it. My grandson, who's 4, we have to keep reenacting it at home. In a Jewish household in northwest London, we're reenacting that coronation. I can't tell you how many times we've done it. And actually, it's quite boring now, I must admit. I'm not still loving it, but he insists. He's got a cloak, the whole thing, 4-year-old. I don't know, little Jewish boy of 4, I don't know, loves the coronation. So you might say multiculturalism alive and flourishing in our house, you might say. Nels, what do you think? There's a prevailing culture?
I think that, so beyond the prevailing culture side of things, or so, when you're actually looking at when you look at integration or assimilation to Britishness, I would argue that possibly no group has done it as much or given up as much, say, as Black people in Britain. That from our marrying patterns to adopting the language, the cuisine, every last little thing we've pretty much given a lot of what we are up at the culture, at the altar of Britishness, and we've brought a lot to the table too to try and actually influence that culture or so. And no group has been punished for it more. That the idea of Black British people being deported from their own country as they grew older, and not just any group of Black British people, the ones who are descendants from the enslaved group of Africans.
But I would say that there was collective horror and disgust at that, to the point that the Home Secretary then, Amber, had to resign over it because it was so seriously taken. And my God, I interviewed some of those gentlemen and ladies. It was appalling. But I would say one other thing, though.
Please.
Very often when they came into my studio, this is at the BBC, and one gentleman came with his belongings in a carrier bag, and he'd walked all the way from Croydon. He'd walked for hours and hours to get there because he hadn't been able to earn any money because he'd been deemed unemployed. It was like absolutely terrible in every way. Yeah. But I think that one of the things that really did bind all those people was that they kept saying, I'm a proud Englishman. I was proud to be a Londoner. You know, I thought I was British. That's how I felt all my life, a proud British person. I don't think any of them said, despite the appalling wrong done to them, I'm not proud to be British.
I'll take that, Kelechi. There's something really interesting about this, about blackness and how we have to operate with, not just within Britain, but in America too. We saw it in America a bit during the Black Lives Matter time. Remember when Dylan Roof went into the actual church and slaughtered a group of black people over there? The families came out one by one on TV and summarily forgave the actual killer. There's something that we have been almost programmed to do, which is no matter what is thrown at us, no matter what we're subjected to, we are expected to. We almost know the expectation that we're not going to rock the boat, and therefore we just forgive it all, and we're proud of that, and we know the words of the soundbite to say. But when we take that pain and that shame and that suffering back home behind closed doors, it often bursts out in a vicious way that the world doesn't see, and we have to rebuild these people within our community. And when we fail to rebuild them, you then see the catastrophe spilling out within our communities too, which is a very, very tragic side of this.
Absolutely. It's a huge subject, isn't it? I thank you both very much indeed for coming in and also giving it such thought, giving such considered and careful answers to such deep, probing and really impossible questions to answer. So many layers to the whole thing. Thank you very much indeed. Great pleasure to see you both. Coming up after the break, the loss of the Robin Hood tree. A 16-year-old boy has been arrested after the world-famous